where you say the only way you can see it differently is if you have a character flaw. Hello, my name is Todd Shannon, data scientist, social commentator, and getter of buckets. So what are we talking about today? We are talking about social justice. I want to approach this topic from a bit of a technical standpoint because social justice suffers from what I call semantic overload, which means that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and unless we define the term, we cannot really understand it or really have a meaningful discussion about it. So we're going to spend a little bit of time. We're going to be as technical as we can with this definition, and obviously we want to approach everything from a biblical standpoint, from a standpoint of truth, but we do want to take some time to make sure we understand socially, no pun intended, how social justice is understood. Let's define it.
To the mid-19th century writings of an Italian Catholic priest, Luigi Tapparelli. A member of the Society of Jesus, Father Tapparelli was said to have influenced Rerum Novarum, the papal encyclical widely considered to be the foundational document of Catholic social thought and social justice movements. Tapparelli asserted that social justice was a societal norm or construct where individuals, families, and associations would be permitted the maximum range of liberty in pursuit of the good with a minimum of interference or direction from governmental authorities. Social justice, at its most fundamental level, is based on the premise that each human person is made in the image and likeness of God.
So here we can see a basic framework for the original source of social justice. It was a guy who was a Catholic priest. He talked about pursuing the maximum good with minimum interference from the government. Now keep that in mind as we read this kind of new definition of it. Social justice, not what you think it is. For its proponents, social justice is usually undefined. Originally a Catholic term, first used about 1840 for a new kind of virtue or habit necessary for post-agrarian societies, the term has been bent by secular progressive thinkers to mean uniform state distribution of society's advantages and disadvantages. Social justice is really the capacity to organize with others to accomplish ends that benefit the whole community. If people are to live free of state control, they must possess this new virtue of cooperation and association. This is one of the great skills of Americans and, ultimately, the best defense against statism. Now, that last little line is instructive because, as we saw in our initial video, that it's really about people coming together to accomplish or to try to accomplish a common good with minimal state intervention. Now, this is important because this is exactly the idea that the constitutional framers had when they talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They said that people should be free to pursue happiness and to do such whatever it is that would help them to flourish. And what this Catholic priest, I think, is putting his thumb on is that in order to do that, in order for people to attain the maximum good, there needs to be a social component to our pursuit of goodness, right? In other words, people can't do it alone. But secular thinkers, as we've seen, have hijacked the term. Let's read a little bit more. Distribution. Most people's sense of social justice is generic, amounting to nothing more than what we find in the dictionary under social justice. I encourage you to look social justice up, by the way. You'll see what I mean. The distribution of advantages and disadvantages in society. Now, notice that the dictionary definition introduces a new key term, distribution. Alas, the original notion of social justice had very little to do with distribution. Worse, this newly added term suggests that some extra human force, the visible hand, does the distribution, that is, some very powerful human agency, usually the state. So now we're starting to get to the nitty-gritty of how the definition has shifted. Equality. Furthermore, the expression advantages and disadvantages supposes there is a norm of equality by which to measure advantages and disadvantages. Consider this professorial definition. Although it is difficult to agree on the precise meaning of social justice, I take that to most of us it implies, among other things, equality of the burdens, the advantages, and the opportunities of citizenship. Indeed, I take that social justice is intimately related to the concept of equality, and that the violation of it is intimately related to the concept of inequality. Let's continue to read. This definition expresses a whole ideology that equality is good and ought to be enforced. And note what has happened to the word equality. In English, equality usually suggests fairness, equity, or the equitable. But what is equitable is often not to give people the same portions, but rather to give what is proportionate to the efforts of each. Now, I want to pause there for a moment because I think this is important. Because what does the Bible say? The Bible says, whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. There's a principle of sowing and reaping. And if you look in the Bible, there is no emphasis on this supposed equality, which we will continue to unpack, because for the social justice proponent, their main metric for determining whether a society is just is whether there is equity, or whether people have, or whether there is very small levels of disparities in very key and important metrics that they deem more important. For example, there was talk about income inequality. As far as I understand, income inequality is not a problem to be solved. Income inequality is the natural consequence of some people being more productive or gifted or more able than others to produce value and wealth. And there's nothing in the Bible, I challenge anyone to show me, there's nothing in the Bible that suggests otherwise. Consider the parable of the talents for a moment. The parable of the talents, you see a guy who's a business owner, and he gives his money to his employees or stewards as he goes away on a journey. And then he says, do business on my behalf until I return. There was this one guy that said, well, I knew that you were a hard man and that you reap where you did not sow, so I put your money in the ground, and here is your money back. And what was the response that the landowner had, or the proprietor had? He said, you wicked and lazy servant. You knew that I would ask for a return, but you didn't do that. So I'm going to take what you have. I'm going to take the one, and I'm going to give it to the guy that had the most. Now just think about that. He takes the guy that had the least and gives it to the person that had the most. And because in that principle, we see that God is wanting to reward productivity. And there is no predetermined equity or some idea that everybody is supposed to have the same thing. You would think that if equity was a biblical concept, and when I say equity, I mean in the way that is defined in the modern sense, you would think that if that was a real goal, that the person being demonstrated, who is symbolic of God in this particular parable, you would think that they would take the one talent and give it to the person who was had the least. The next person up, maybe the person that had 5. No, he takes it and gives it to the person who had 20. He skips over the people who had just a little bit more than the person who had the one talent, and gives it to the person who has the most. And there are examples of this in the Bible all the way through. We can't go through all of them, but I thought it important to inject a biblical perspective. We'll read one final passage from this article. In European languages, most thinkers follow the model of the French term égalité. Égalité means the equal sign, égal. This on one side is equal to that on the other side. Égalité is a quite different notion from the English equitable. This French continental usage is captured in the American Sociological Review. As I see it, social justice requires equity, fairness, and respect for diversity, as well as the eradication of existing forms of social oppression. Social justice entails a redistribution of resources from those who have unjustly gained them to those who justly deserve them. And it also means creating and ensuring the processes of truly democratic participation in decision making. It seems clear that only a decisive redistribution of resource and decision making power can ensure social justice and authentic democracy. So now we start to see it. In short, the new social justice is political. It is rooted and grounded in a political ideology, some sort of socialism or Marxism. They're very closely related. We will not define them in technical terms because I'm trying to keep this video shorter than 2 hours. All right. So, but we will continue to talk about this. So, but unless you think that this is just something that these guys are writing, let's take a listen to some other resources online where they talk about social justice. Here's a video from a college where they talk to some students when they are discussing how can their college achieve social justice. Listen to what this young lady says.
The qualification, everyone has different backgrounds, and we cannot treat everyone the same way.
Notice it was just a short little clip, but very instructive. Notice she says, we cannot treat everyone the same way. That is exactly what it means to have a fair society. Everyone gets the same shake. Everyone gets the same opportunities. But what the social justice proponents are now wanting to do is they want to shift laws so that the outcomes are the same. There's equality of outcome. And this is a very different and new concept of social justice because it requires, as we've read many times in the Heritage Foundation article, a redistribution, kind of a making things right. And normally that always has to involve the government. And this is exactly what Marxism and socialism is. So when we talk about social justice and we mention that, and then people get a little offended that we're saying, well, you're saying things that are Marxist in nature. We're not making it up. Okay, these are very real concepts. So now I want to shift this to where I think this has really become a problem. And that is, in the church, there are people who are very pro-social justice, and then there are people who are not on board for obvious reasons. Why? Because we don't, first of all, even have the same frame of reference for what it even means. And secondly, when it comes to social justice from a racial standpoint, then we start to get a real divide, right? And the race issue is, in my opinion, the major issue that we need to really settle if there's ever going to be unity in the body of Christ. So as a jumping off point to this particular part of the conversation, we're going to listen to one of the people that I really admire, a guy named Flame. So let's take a listen.
I think when the unfortunate, untimely death of George Floyd happened, I was looking for a certain response from the church that I thought would be universal, and I didn't see it. I thought it was going to be like, okay, this is the one we're all going to rally behind. It's clear. We all see 8 minutes and 46 seconds, right? 46, 48. We all saw the tape, the footage, and that was wrong, right? And as Christians, we're heartbroken by that, right? And when it was
radio
sort
silence,
of crickets, you know what I mean, in certain spaces that I would camp out in or frequent, I felt that sense of, dang, if I felt it, and I thought we were us, and us was I, and you were me, and I'm you, and you didn't feel it, what's going on? And I think that's when, wifey and I started to have questions and start to think through things deeper. And the result of it was identifying what was going on, which was there was a parallel train running alongside of Christianity that was hard to detect because it's so synchronized in many ways.
Okay, so here's what's interesting about that. Flame talks about the George Floyd situation being a kind of a turning point for him in his understanding of how we should kind of, as Christians, react to social justice issues, right? He was like, all right, the George Floyd thing happened. Everybody saw it. It was wrong. Let's all get behind that, right? And in his mind, and the truth said it actually, but he concurred. He's like, there was crickets from many people in the church. Airplane. Anyway, there was crickets from many people in the church. And I thought this was odd because I actually couldn't think of a single person when the George Floyd situation became public. I couldn't think of a single person who was like, oh, there was nothing wrong with what they did to him. I mean, not a single person. You're talking about that was as close to universal condemnation as we could have gotten to. And it was actually, I thought, would have been a good opportunity for us to unify. But the problem is this. You see, while Flame was saying, well, some people didn't respond, yet we still had, in my view, universal condemnation of the act itself. I think where we differed is what we considered to be the source of the injustice, which is really strange, right? Because there's this very specific narrative about a black man being killed by the cops and that it is racially motivated. And so this is what his idea was. This is what he's saying. This is why he's saying there was not universal response from the church regarding that issue, because not everyone got on the kind of Black Lives Matter, police brutality narrative, which is what he thought would have been, hey, isn't this proof? Isn't this what we've been talking about with the Black Lives Matter movement? Isn't that now, wouldn't that put you over the hump to say, oh, well, I guess there is systemic oppression by the police for black people in America. Let's chant Black Lives Matter. And that's where the breakdown comes. So here's an interesting thing that I want to really kind of unpack, because I think it goes to the heart of why we cannot come together on this issue. When a situation like George Floyd happens, or any other police brutality situation that we see in the news, and the victim is black and the police officer is white, the problem is this. It is simply asserted that the brutality was racially motivated. And no one is even asked to provide any proof that it was racially motivated. No, it's just assumed. And the question must be asked is that why is it fair to assume that it was racially motivated? And this is why I took so much time defining social justice in the beginning, because if you understand what the social justice movement, what the proponents are saying or what they're proposing, they look at broad disparities as proof of some injustice. There's underrepresentation of blacks in leadership and business, therefore discrimination. There are not enough women CEOs in major corporations, therefore discrimination. They don't need to actually provide specific proof or examples in a specific instance that it was racially motivated. They do look at the broad spectrum, the broad kind of the landscape of the distributions of outcomes in a particular area, and therefore assert some injustice. This is important to understand. And I think there's a really good resource that I want to recommend for you, and it's a book by Thomas Sowell. It's called Discrimination and Disparities. He makes the point that disparities are actually the default or the norm in nature. It's not to be thought of as something irregular. And so he says, well, we're expecting all of these uniform outcomes. That is not what we should be expecting, because there's so many instances. He gives as an example that even in the same family, the firstborn has a very disparate outcome with respect to their ascension into leadership, their earning of income. Most U.S. presidents were firstborn, or a disproportionate number of U.S. presidents were firstborn. A disproportionate number of firstborn children go on to higher education and things of that nature. So he's saying, think about how many things are the same in a household where you have the same two parents, right? And if you have 3 or 4 kids, but the firstborn consistently outperforms the younger siblings, that's an indication that uniform distribution of outcomes should not be expected. He gives example after example of this sort of thing. And one particular case he put forth was this case where the Department of Labor actually brought a lawsuit against a major corporation, and they said, well, based on our numbers, we expect for there to be so many female leaders in your organization, but they're significantly lower than that. So they sued this company. Now the company took them 10 years, and get this, $20 million. $20 million fighting that lawsuit in court, and they eventually won. But the thing that he underscored was that no time during that entire lawsuit were they required to bring forth a single flesh and blood female who was actually alleging that she was discriminated against. The whole basis of the lawsuit was that there should be more women in your leadership roles based on some mathematical model or where we think the distribution should be. So they're assuming a certain outcome, and if the outcome didn't happen, then they assume discrimination, in this case, sexism. This is a major thrust of social justice proponents, and people don't even know, I think many who even espouse social justice, they don't even understand, I think, how that is baked into their thinking. It tends to be something that kind of sneaks in. This is the problem when we have these shifting definitions of things and we don't stop and slow down to define them properly. So let's just go back to the situation at hand. Here Flame says, not everybody got on board. Well, everybody condemned it, but he says there's still a rift. They provide no specific proof of social justice or injustice in that particular case where there was some sort of racial component to the George Floyd killing, nor do they even attempt to provide any proof in any of the other cases. But yet, it's supposed to be understood that there's some sort of racial component. To be fair, obviously we have a racial history in this country, and that cannot be discounted. But I think the idea that we should indefinitely assume that all disparities in outcomes with respect to criminal justice or incarceration, which are all topics we will talk about at a later time, that all of these things are the results of some sort of racial injustice, lingering racial injustice. We never have to demonstrate specifically why that's true in any particular case, but we can continue to look at aggregate results and just assume that it's there. That's not good enough. But I want to take this a step further because when we talk about racial injustice and we talk about police brutality, oftentimes we talk about the killings and the police shootings. Well, in 2019, there were 9 unarmed blacks killed by police in the United States. On average, police officers in the United States shoot and kill about 1,000 people a year. It's been pretty consistent, at least since 2014. That's a pretty consistent number. Last year, there were about that many, and 9 of them were unarmed and black. Now, unarmed does not necessarily mean not a threat, but let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that they were non-threatening. So all 9 of these were unjust shootings, without question. Now, that's not necessarily true, but let's just grant it. That hardly rises to the level of an epidemic, right? So KB addresses this. This is another big homie. I got my Christian rapper critique going today, apparently. But this provides a lot of content. These are all guys I really respect, so don't come at me trying to say I'm hating on my Christian rap brothers. And he talks about this. So I want you to listen really quickly to what KB has to say.
Identity. And let me be clear when I say the word abuse. When we think about police brutality, if you only see it as instances where police officers unjustly take the life of a citizen, then you have truncated what we're talking about.
Very myopic view of police brutality.
Because really what people say in response to this is, if you're trying to convince me that police officers are on this open season thing where they are running around the country trying to find black people and brown people so they can kill them, if you want me to buy that, then you got me messed up, because I know that's not the case. I know that you all are trying to say this leftist or BLM
Right.
Agenda is to make us think that police officers are hunting black people down. That literally is a caricature of what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
That perhaps you may not I feel confident that me or nobody that I know will be killed by the police. I can say that. I feel confident that it won't happen. But I hold that in tension with the fact that I don't know a single black person. I don't know one black person that has not been unjustly harassed, roughed up, or jailed by the police. I don't know one. I can't name a single black person. There might be some. No, I've even the sisters.
As far as you know,
As
yeah.
far as I can think, and I'm being honest.
Now, notice that KB in this particular clip is saying that we are truncating the conversation when we talk strictly in terms of police shootings, right? Because there's a broader thing. There's general harassment and things of that nature. In my opinion, this is a little bit of moving the goalposts because, most of the time when we talk about these shootings, there's in almost every case, there's a legal reason for the cops to be interacting with the person. But most people's complaint is that, well, even though there's a legal reason, just because they committed a crime, that doesn't give police the right to shoot them, right? So we're kind of conflating two things that aren't the same. On the one hand, he's saying, well, we need to broaden the conversation because it's not just about the police shootings. Well, but then you can't also turn around and use the police shootings as your primary reference point and basis for saying that there's evidence of social injustice or that there's racial injustice happening on behalf of the police officers. If the racial injustice that we see from the shootings, or the supposed racial injustice from the police shootings, if that's not the main point of emphasis, or if that's not the main point of evidence, then we can't also expect people to respond to that when you point out the fact that there's actually very few people who are shot in a way that could be considered unjust by the police. So we have to pick one. Either we're going to say, well, it's not really the shootings, it's more so this general harassment and other incarceration issues. And then we focus on that. And then we take the shootings off the table. But we're connecting the two. But even more important than that is the issue that he says that, well, I just know that everybody that in my circle has had many, many, many situations where this is just a common experience for black people. Well, that's kind of interesting because I think Lil Wayne has a different perspective.
Where are we in the United States of America in race relations and what you see from day to day in your life?
Skip, they wouldn't want to ask me that. They wouldn't want my answer to represent it because God knows I have been nothing but blessed. My whole path, these 33 years have been nothing but a blessing. I have never, never is a strong word, I've never dealt with racism, and I'm glad I didn't have to. And I don't know if it's because of my blessings, I don't know if it's, but it is my reality. So I would have to say, not only did I thought it was over, I still believe it's over, but obviously it isn't.
So you've never experienced any offensive behavior from any other color or?
No, sir.
Wow.
Now here we see Weezy. Now let's think about who this is. This is Weezy, Tunchi the Boss, as he calls himself. I think that, I don't know Lil Wayne's peoples, but I think there's a high probability that there's a lot of felons and a lot of, people who are into some unsavory illegal activity in his immediate circle. He tells a story of how he shot himself as a young kid and it was a white police officer that saved his life. Lil Wayne is saying, well, this is my truth, right? I don't know. All of this talk about racism everywhere, I don't know what y'all talking about. So who's right? Is it KB or is it Lil Wayne? Or how about my scenario? I'm 42 years old. I have never had a single solitary negative interaction with the police. Not one, not even close. Should we use that as proof that there's no racism in America? Well, obviously not. This is what we call anecdotal evidence. And a lot of this stuff, particularly when we're talking about so-called harassment and things like that, a lot of it is very subjective. And this is why I like to stick to the hard statistics. Things like incarceration rates and how often police officers have to respond to shootings or police shootings, because There's no question about whether someone is killed or not. There's no question about whether someone is incarcerated. Issues of harassment or whether the cop was rude to you because he was racist, very, very sketchy and very difficult to prove and demonstrate unless you have direct knowledge. So the point that I'm making is that we all have experiences, but we have to be able to anchor the conversation in something that is not subjective. Finally, I just want to interject one other video by the big homie Flame where he talks about white supremacy.
And they intermingle with so much so that it will be hard to detect. And that Christian nationalism is a false Christianity. It's one that's more patriotic in nature. It's one that's rooted in white supremacy as a goal to sustain, to forward, but to so align itself with biblical Christianity so as to pull from a collection of people that can be manipulated into forwarding a more patriotic American agenda. And when I saw that, I was like, I don't want any parts of that.
Okay, so this is where the communication really breaks down. Flame is essentially alleging that if you cannot get on board with the Black Lives Matter sort of mentality, and I'm not even talking about necessarily supporting the organization, but the idea and the premise of their social justice movement, supposedly seeking racial equality in policing. If you can't get on board with that, then there must be some underlying white supremacy. And this, my friends, is where it breaks down. You see, if you can't grant your ideological opponent some sort of, charity in how you look at their viewpoint, where you say the only way you can see it differently is if you have a character flaw or if you have some nefarious agenda, then that's when the conversations break down. There are many reasonable arguments that would suggest that the racial disparities that we see are not necessarily the result of hatred or racism. There again, disparities does not necessarily equal nefarious activity or discrimination. And we're going to uncover that. Now, this is just part one. I want you guys to stay tuned because I cannot cover everything in one video. This video is already way longer than I hoped it would be. But listen, we're going to dive into the hard facts and we're going to have a hard conversation. And if you find yourself saying, well, the only reason why Todd is saying X is because, he's been co-opted by the white supremacists, then this channel is not for you. You're not ready for this conversation, if I can be frank. And that's about as directly as I can put it, because this is about being able to face the facts. And what you need to do is steel man your opponent's arguments. Don't take a weak point or try to make some point about somebody's poor character to refute their argument. That's not a solid way to communicate. If you're going to make claims, then you have to demonstrate that they are true. And you have to grant the benefit of the doubt to your ideological opponent that they're making arguments in good faith. And that's the only thing that keeps the lines of communication alive. I said in my initial video that the only way we can have unity is if we have an exchange of ideas. And sometimes we have to look at our brothers and sisters in the eye and say, I'm sorry, but your perspective on that doesn't line up with the facts. And that's completely okay. It's okay to do that. And I think it's our duty to do that. So friends, I want you to stay with me. This is part one of this series on social justice. If you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe. And I hope that I see you in the next video. Till next time, friends, God bless you.